Hello. This is the ceremonial. We got a minute or two, but I guess we got to get started here. So, clear my throat there. Those are totally chocolate. Yeah, they're like they're like slippery. They're like glass. But the soft blue to the bone is like.
We have a lot to cover tonight, so please start to sit down.
So I'm clearing my room once again. We've got about 70% of the people seated, so I'm encouraging the rest of them. So grab your beverages and food and have a seat, please. Okay. So I should swallow here. So hi. My name is David True, and for those of you who haven't been to an IPA event before, I'm the president of NIPA. Deb is one of our board and works very closely with us. And Ulrika of Deloitte has been a good friend of NIPA, and they've hosted many of our events, so I'm very, very grateful for all of that. First, welcome to the event. If you've not been to an IPA event before, the whole idea of an IPA event is to have a conversation. So Deb will be running this tonight in her expert fashion. But if you got questions, feel free to ask, because we believe more than just listening to people on a panel, if you walk away having had some sort of interaction or questions, you remember things more. Let me think if there's anything else to thank. I just want to thank all the folks who have put the hard work into making this happen. And I guess at this point, thank you for attending. We hope to see you at other events. Go to the website and see, because we post them there. And I shall turn things over to Deborah.
Thank you, David. I will. Welcome, everybody. Deb Baxley, as David said. We're partners also in a company called Agility Advisors. We're a payments consultancy. And first, I would like to invite our host to come up and say a couple words.
Just a couple. Welcome to Deloitte. We're very excited to be doing this with NIPA. And I did a few panels over the past 12 months, and I just realized that Deb is one-upping me here in terms of having two panels in the same night. And this is great because one really has the merchant perspective, which in payments we need to hear a lot more of. So thanks for having this event here, and thanks everybody for turning out in the middle of summer. It's pretty good attendance, and I hope you're enjoying the facility of being in this beautiful building. And look out of the windows before you leave, because this is a $45 view if you actually take the elevator. Okay, thank you. It's $1 million.
Okay, funny little story behind setting up this event. I've been lobbying for a number of months, or maybe even a year, that we should have a card not present or e-commerce fraud event, because it's such a hot topic. And I went to CMP Expo, and I met some of these vendors, and I was also the judge of CMP Expo's top. They had some awards for different vendors this year. And so when we announced this, and I reached out to a few people, all of a sudden I have an embarrassment of riches, because I had way too many panelists. I said, what are we going to do with 10 people? So that's why we have two panels tonight. So it's going to be action-packed. First, we're going to have a merchant fireside chat led by Civic Science. And then we're going to have an expert panel, which will be more of the traditional fraud experts. So I'm going to introduce everybody quickly, even though they're not up here yet. We have Megan Brady over there, who's a fraud investigator with Square. She's been at Square since 2011, and I'm sure she's going to give us some hair-raising stories. And then we have Rachel Livingston here, who is the director of operations for Zola.com, which is a wedding site that helps with planning and gift registry. And then we have Mitch Mahfood, who is there next to Rachel. He's a senior fraud analyst with Shutterstock and has been in the fraud business for 6 years, hopefully on the white hat side, not the black hat side. He has a degree in applied intelligence and intimate familiarity with card not present fraud analysis and investigations. And then we have Stefan Nanzig, who is over there, who is the VP of Marketing with Signified, and it's a fraud hub and guaranteed fraud protection service. And then Jeff Sekasawaga, I think I butchered your name, I'm sorry. I love this title, Trust and Safety Architect with SIFT Science, and they're fraud analytics and fraud management. And then we have Prakash Santana, who's there, and he is a Managing Director of Payments Integrity Cyber Risk Services with Deloitte Consulting, and formerly headed fraud at MasterCard. And then we have Colin Sims over here, and Colin is two people tonight. He's CFO with Forder, which is a fraud analytics firm, but formerly the COO of Delivery.com, which apparently people even commit fraud against food and dry cleaning. So okay. So what we're going to do is switch over to the slides, and Jeff, please come up. I can just do first.
Okay. Hi, good evening, everyone. As if it hasn't been stated already, just again wanted to thank NIPE and Deloitte for hosting this event, and thank you all for coming out. I'll try to keep it brief because, again, as we alluded to, there's so many great people that I want you to hear from, so we'll keep this light. So e-commerce is what we're here to talk about tonight, right? So I just wanted to give you a sense of some table stakes, right? There's some approximations that $4.5 trillion of e-commerce will happen by 2021. Cyber Monday last year was the biggest on record at $6.6 billion. And then also some recent numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau had, there's a ton of caveats, but U.S. retail e-commerce for Q1 was over $120 billion. So a natural question you might be asking yourself is, what gives us the rocket ship? What is driving these volumes? And realistically, a lot of it is just based on our own behavior that we're familiar with, right? One quote I really liked from Forbes was just kind of talking about the mobile, the personal, the engaging, really fueling that. I think a good anecdote is, I'm based on the West Coast. I was just visiting my sister in Orange County, California, and we went to this retail center called Pacific City in Huntington Beach, highly recommend. And it's just a beautiful shopping space, but it's outdoors, open airs. And my sister was telling me, even though the name of the structure is Pacific City, everyone calls it Selfie City because there's walls and spaces and Wi-Fi. So even though you're there to shop, you may be buying up and picking up online, but people like to share those experiences. And it's really engaging customers in a way that's beyond just what is expected from setting up a shop and hoping people come in. So there's a lot of that there. The second quote recently from Jeff Bezos was, again, we're talking about tonight, the ever-evolving pace of fraud and machine learning. And, Amazon uses that not only for the recommendations, that positive side of the house, but also for fraud detection, which leads me into my hopefully not heavy-handed joke. So really, what you want to think about when you have big data, when you have AI or machine learning concepts, is really in our Spider-Man situation is, are you able to properly identify who's good, who is bad, who's somewhere in between? And really unlocking that, and again, we'll hear from all of our panelists tonight about the same subject. It's just having a better understanding of where you want to introduce friction thoughtfully, smartly, and also when you don't want to do that, and just get out of the way. And hopefully just have a truer sense of those populations over time. So again, even if you don't believe me, if you don't believe my premise, there are a tremendous amount of people here, not just from Civ Science, that I would like to welcome onto the stage at the moment. So we're going to do the merchant panel first. So Mitch, Rachel, and Colin, Sonnet, and Megan.
Should we just do a hand clap? Yeah.
As it was good to see, make one comment on my side. You look at me, I'm not young. but my wife is not that far away from me in age, yet if she can't buy it on her phone, she probably won't buy it.
Oh, there you go.
There's an pause.
Yeah.
That is magic.
That was awesome.
And I'm the only person that brought their wine up, so we're off to a hell of a start.
I'm gonna get my beer.
Yes.
Start that trend.
Thank you.
By the way, this is being live streamed too.
Oh, fantastic. Hello to those watching live
If
around
we
the
remember
world.
to turn it on.
Yeah, so my first and last merchant fireside chat. Thank you all for doing that. So we're talking tonight about how fraud evolves, wanting to stay on top of that. And I think regardless of people's depth of knowledge in that field, someone usually have some familiarity with rules. So the first question for the panel is, when do rule-based systems tend to fall apart for either you, or how have you seen it in the past, and what advice would you have for all of us here tonight? Do you want to?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Indeed, that was the first temptation I think merchants have, is to write rules. Because you see patterns and you want to capitalize on your internal knowledge. In my experience, the rules have two problems. One is they're always reactive. And the other is at some point they do fail, and when they do, it's catastrophic. and you can sort of lull yourself into the sense that everything's going fine, but when it breaks down, you end up having a new type of attack, or a particular rule is getting exploited, and you really try to chase it. And you also have to, there's a lot of institutional knowledge that has to go with rules, where you're constantly looking back, saying, why was this rule written? Does it still make sense? So there's, I think, an operational burden that over time really becomes material and isn't when you first implement them.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Just to piggyback on that too, I think like Colin mentioned, like stagnation is one of the biggest problems with rules. You can write something that's very reactive to a problem you had. In my experience, when I came on to Shutterstock, we had a couple of like hard-coded rules that were like relied on really heavily for whatever reason I couldn't know, and they were essentially just blocking countries and more so just doing more damage to us from good revenue perspective than actually preventing fraud. And one of our biggest things was just kind of stripping away the hard-coded and rule-based system that we had, and moving to a more proactive and like dynamic system at that point. Typically, you'll see, for example, maybe one country's hitting you hard in fraud, so you write a rule that says, countries from maybe Vietnam or Russia, like let's start blocking those orders more heavily, but then you realize you're starting to take away like 50% of your actual good revenue from those countries as well, and you're not really learning anything from it other than it's just one area that could be risky. So I think stagnation, and the other problem too is just not really doing a good assessment of your rules like on a weekly or monthly basis. You'll write these rules, think you've written gold, and you never really go back to them at that point to actually like review these and actually like assess the performance of those rules as well.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because I think it's one of those things where you are usually in a sensitive place because you need to create the rule in the first place, right? So you're trying to put out some kind of fire, so you get it out, and then you feel some temporary relief, and then maybe the new fire starts, and you just don't have the time or thought to go back, because sunrise, sunset, more fraud, and that can be super damaging over time. To your point, like if you just don't check the efficacy of those, or if you don't have like sprints set up to like revisit those rules, it can be like you just have this legacy debt, even though it was well intentioned at the start, but it atrophies quickly. Anything you want to add?
Sure. So one place I actually thought in answering this, it's kind of convenient to say actually where rules might work. And again, you kind of mentioned the firefight. There are going to be tactical situations in which I think a rule and rules are very beneficial. if you really just need to quell something quickly. It's also very tempting to go for rules because I think it most mimics like what a fraud analyst is noticing. It's the pattern recognition we all have, and that's why we like doing what we do. But we all know that we have to change our pattern recognition over time, and it's the same thing with rules. So over time, great for a quick firefight, not so great for the long term, since the fraudsters, it's an organized attack, they will find every little boundary of your rule. And it's actually kind of fun to watch them do it, but that's what you definitely need more than rules as part of your fraud plan.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think it's good to have a mix of both. So like you said, it's great to put out a fire that's already blazing. And then also something that we do is we try to be proactive about our rules. So, we'll launch new products that we think are going to be very susceptible to fraud. So we'll just create a rule. So like for the first week, let's just review every order until we feel okay. But the key is making sure you do go back and deactivate those old rules and not just leave them.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is an unfair question to ask. If you can't answer this, do not answer it. Do you have a cadence at which you do that? Is it like a set?
Yeah, it's like every 2 weeks.
Oh, cool. That's pretty good. Be like
That's a
Rachel.
good answer.
I have nothing to add. All right. So we talked a lot about some of the limits of rules, but we're kind of here espousing, artificial intelligence and machine learning. So are there limits to how helpful that technology and systems can be? And then secondarily, I think Megan, you already answered this, but is there still a necessity for manual reviews even if you do use these technologies? Yeah, open up for anyone.
Well, I'll jump into the manual review thing. We obviously at Square probably have one of the most sophisticated data science teams that helps us with our fraud detection. We have amazing cross-functional team with engineers, data scientists working on this problem. So definitely there's technical solutions that should be considered at all times. But we still have a manual review team, and there's a few reasons why that's going to be necessary moving forward. Manual reviewers have intuition that rules aren't going to have, that machine learning isn't going to necessarily have. People who are very familiar with what's happening there can anticipate what might happen next. So again, if you're watching a fraudster skirt around the rule, you can kind of think about, well, what can we do differently? So that's where that manual intuition is important. But it's also extremely important, I think, from the customer experience side. And just to give some context, I've been on Square's fraud team in the past, and something I really liked is that we never made fraud an easy problem to solve because we cared so much about what we call insults. So if our fraud detection models are insulting good customers, it's not good enough. It can make our loss numbers, minuscule, but we definitely don't want to lose and impact good customers in a negative way. And part of that is, there's certain things that you can automate for sure in fraud, but there's definitely the edge cases that you want to have a human be involved in to make sure you're not opening yourself up to bad customer insults and experiences too.
Nice, yeah, having also worked on that team, I think it was interesting, the vernacular of insults is very intentional, because I think oftentimes you report on these metrics, like false positives, not false negatives, and it can be cold, to be polite. And you really lose the empathy of the human. If someone's coming to you to help with their wedding registry, it's like a very important thing. And, even though it may be like one incident or whatever your language is, like to them.
The wedding.
Yeah. Not that you ever would, but they would tell you that, right? Yeah. So thanks for that. And anyone else?
Yeah, I'm gonna resist answering this from the fraud detection perspective and from the merchant, and contain my answer to the merchant perspective. But the two are inextricably linked to me, because at delivery we didn't have the luxury of reviewing transactions, and so I tell people a lot. The on-demand space is it's like a canary in the coal mine, right? It will be exploited first because it's easier to exploit, and so I think. In a lot of ways, you see the newest technologies being employed in spaces like that, and the insult, the irony of the insult rate there is that far more fraudsters called in than legitimate customers, and they used the "I'm hungry, where's my food? I'm gonna kill you" line a lot, and to great effect, actually. And we noticed a very high number of chargebacks associated with those calls. And so we sought an automated solution out of necessity, right? And what I was actually very surprised by the level of accuracy when we did, which is one of the reasons I switched over to Forter, is because that canary in the coal mine issue, right? What we were experiencing was going to be a widespread problem, and I will say from on being on the detection side, what I'm realizing is the inefficiency of the review process, and it's because it really doesn't matter if the reps, because we had reps in delivery, they did review transactions in a matter of minutes, right? And they had to get through a queue, and the number of transactions they could review is very low, right? And we were 24/7. Right? The consistency that they had in reviewing transactions at midnight, very different than 8 a.m. And very different during the dinner rush, right?
Yeah.
And so there is a lot of human bias in there. And the number of data points that they could look at was, you're absolutely right. They're trying to weave a narrative in their head, but they're weaving a narrative in their head based on, 7 data points, most, right? Probably much less than that. And while, AI models do take a lot of time to train and learn and customize, ultimately they can process 9,000 data points at the same time, using a broader data network and more context than a person can. So I do think that is the way that we're going, right? And the threat that you're facing is a very automated, sophisticated, mutating threat, right? That I don't think mere mortals are equipped to handle.
More to come on that in the expert panel. But yeah, it's a really good point. Starting my career, I was a fraud reviewer at Google, and I very much appreciate that sentiment around time of day. Mm-hmm. But as a manager, some of the toughest things, you ask your team, do this 10 times for me today, and then imagine asking them to do it 500, and the face is just very honest. They'll come back to you, but you have to be honest too about how effective they'll be on that 500th review as opposed to the 10th, 50th, 100th. It's tough. And I think that's also why a lot of people that work in fraud, you kind of are kindred spirits somewhat, because you feel that pain. But it's good when you win, but it's also very real.
It also makes you weep for the criminal justice system.
No comment. Moving on. So our penultimate question on the merchant panel. How do you all guaranteed, how do you view guaranteed fraud schemes? Mitch, you want to pop in?
What do you mean exactly, the guaranteed fraud scheme, exactly?
My understanding of that would be sometimes you might work with companies that might have guarantees on fraud they can prevent for you, or
They indemnify you against fraud, so if you buy their service and you get any fraud, they have to eat it.
Okay.
Yeah, so, just for those on the live stream. Do you want to say that again?
Oh, you could repeat it.
Oh. Basically, the fraud provider you work with will indemnify you against the fraud loss. They'll take that on their shoulders.
I guess about how much budget do they have? That's the first one. I guess you would have to approach that with caution as well, because I think a lot of merchants, when they first start getting into fraud detection, might not actually have a full understanding of what their fraud problem really is. So I think when you start exploring those kind of options for an identified fraud scheme like that, you need to have a better handle of like what you're dealing with fraud. So get a handle on your chargebacks before you start to buy into these. Start to even like build the concept of having an actual fraud team if you're not at that point. I think there's a lot of merchants who think that once they buy into any kind of fraud prevention model, that they think that their problem just goes away completely. I've dealt with it the same too, where we'll kind of deploy a new model and they say, okay, great, we're dealing with this problem, account takeover, for example, and they're like, once we deploy this model, our problem goes from 100% to 0%. I'm like, it's not really like that. We're gonna make, we're gonna do some damage to the fraudsters, but it doesn't just go away completely. So I think you need to kind of like temper your expectations when you buy into these, and you have to understand that you have to continually work with these companies to provide them data and strategies on how you can best work with your fraud solution. It's not going to be, we bought a fraud prevention model, we turned it on, and now our problems have gone away. If that company does come around, like, great, yeah, let me know. But until then, no, it's always a working process. I don't think there is always the bullseye target for fraud. It's always continually working to kind of like, temper down your fraud expectations. So.
Yeah, I agree. So I used to work for a company that I won't name that used to have an in-house fraud team, but then switched over to a company that did this. And you kind of just have to weigh like, what does it cost me to keep it in-house versus what percentage of revenue am I giving away for this company? Because usually they charge you anywhere from like 1 to 3% of your total sales. The other thing to be mindful of is they only guarantee you against like hostile credit card fraud, so unauthorized purchases. So if your problem is really friendly fraud with like little kids using their parents' credit card to buy product, like they don't cover that. Or if you're getting chargebacks because of customer service issues, so the item not matching the description on the website or an item not received, they don't cover those as well. So you kind of have to do your due diligence at the beginning to make sure it's really worth your while. And there are some companies who like don't want to deal with fraud like at all, and if that's you, go for it. But also be mindful of your like decline rates, because also with a lot of those schemes, they're going to decline a lot more transactions. You're going to have a lot more false positives at the beginning, so you kind of just have to weigh the pros and cons.
Yeah, what I really like in both of those answers, like thematically, is just knowing your own data, like what's working well or not well, and then also making sure like whoever you partner with, you have an equal expectation there too, right? Of knowing where they are providing value or not.
I love the insult idea. Is that what you call it, insult?
Yes.
So how does one measure the degree of insult and then feed it back to the fraud prevention team to calibrate?
Can you repeat the question?
So how do we define our false positive rate more as an insult rate at Square, and the way that we calculate that rate and then feed it back in, we consider it you can keep it quite simple and say if an account was frozen and then unfrozen, that's a pretty good sign that maybe the freeze was wrong and that likely insulted the person. They probably prevented them from receiving funds from a transaction that they expected. So that's the simplest way to really look at the account level of how many people have been insulted. I believe we use numerous calculations. We have very fancy data scientists, but that's the basic idea of an insult.
So, question: if you guys have heard of EMV 3D Secure 2.0, which not sure if it's out yet, but that will the fraud goes back to the bank, then the issuer, and then you still get chargebacks. But are you interested in that, or are you skeptical?
The question is 3D Secure 2.0, skeptical or not? I saw the way.
This is something we think a lot about, actually. Well, both on the merchant side and on the fraud side. And what I would call your attention to there is there are two things that 3DS will always lack the way it's structured. One is the right incentive. Banks have very different incentives on approving transactions and taking risk, especially when they wear it, than the merchant does, right? And it goes to the margins on the transaction, right? A bank's margins on a $100 transaction are far, far lower than the merchants are in almost every case. with some small exceptions like marketplace businesses. So that is one of the fundamental flaws with it. The other major flaw with it is 3DS actually the network is built on relatively thin data. The issuing banks get what is passed to them basically through the Visa MasterCard pipes, which isn't that much actually. And you compare that with what kind of information a online retailer potentially has, since they directly touch the consumer, and whether or not you believe in biometrics or behavioral biometrics. I don't know if anybody saw Stacy Crowley's article in the New York Times recently, yesterday on it. There's a lot of data there that you can potentially capitalize on. But even if you don't go that deep, you still know far, far more on the account level than the issuing banks ever will. And so you combine that with mediocre incentives to approve transactions, not a great structural solution, in my opinion.
So effectively you're saying that this is a solution that's built with a bias towards what the banks are interested in, whereas the merchants are much better equipped to do a job in judging it, yet there's a great incentive to turn on 3D Secure because there's financial incentives to do that.
That is correct. Well said.
If I can repeat it back to you and get it right, then I probably got it myself.
I have a question for.
Oh, you have one behind you. Go get. Go ahead, please.
I would just like to get back to your statement about that because you're describing the current 3DS, but not the 2.0.
Right.
I work at Mastercard.
I feel like I should run the mic over.
So I would just like to have the group get the correct statement, but the 2.0 is going to correct exactly those conditions. It's going to provide the rich device data and the environmental data that is lacking today in the 3DS, which I understand what you're talking about. And it's also going to correct some of those issuer decline situations that are, happening today, particularly in North America, perhaps more in the U.S. than some other places. So I just wanted you to know that, but
yes, you're absolutely right. I was talking about 1.0. That's correct.
Right, okay, so 2.0 is coming. It's not there yet, but we can send you more information about it, whatever's in the public domain.
I had a quick question for Megan. So Megan, you're not really a merchant, you're more like a merchant processor, and you have little, I guess mostly smaller, but maybe some bigger ones. So does that complicate your job? And then also, do those merchants, do they do fraud checking, or do they depend on you to do most of it?
So we're the merchant of record, and of course with all the merchants below us, so we are handling all of the fraud detection for our merchants to some degree. There's a way in which, and it does complicate things. So obviously we're going to try to prevent losses from our side, from fraudulent merchants. We're going to try to enable good merchants. That's kind of the two things that we're looking at. But then we're also going to try to prevent good merchants from having fraudulent buyers as well. And while we have a ton of data on our merchants, obviously, we're working with not as much data on buyers typically. So one of the biggest focuses we have now is, of course, preventing our good merchants from losing money to a fraudulent buyer. Not just on e-commerce, you can kind of think of that's someone just entering in a stolen credit card. That's fine, but there's a lot more elaborate buyer fraud scams out there than that. There's a lot of social engineering that goes on like that. So we also take, as part of our fraud work, the mission to educate our merchants, to protect themselves too against that, because we need them to do that too. We don't have all the information about that transaction, so we need them to be very well informed.
Yeah, and then I'll say as a former Square, I think it's a great answer, and then also I think this goes with maybe anyone here really is, even if Square were to process that transaction, it's always up to the discretion of that merchant if they actually want to fulfill it, even if they, trust Square, which hopefully they do, to, catch all that stuff, even if they felt like this doesn't pass the smell test, then it's like, you by no means have to fulfill it.
Are you starting to see more account takeovers and credit card fraud? What sort of ratio is that, and how do you handle account takeover? Because with all the data has been stolen. That seems to be picking up.
Thank you. The question was, do you see more of traditional credit card payment fraud versus account takeover? If you have any numbers around ratios, and how do you generally approach that?
Yeah, I don't want to give specific numbers. However, so I think when I came under Shutterstock, payment fraud was a big aspect, and we got a handle on that. And account takeover has really become like our bigger issue in terms of fraud. So I do kind of see it as the expanding like fraud pattern. It feels to me it's a lot easier to go out and just scrape an email and a password from one of a million forum type sites that post that, and then go in and try and like test a merchant's website to see if you can access an account. I always make the joke that our losses today, like in a pie graph, like ATO is kind of doing like the Pac-Man versus traditional payment fraud right now. So a lot of my focus is there. We see a lot of issues as well with kind of like the one and done logins. So the brute force attacks, we don't see as much of in terms of somebody just trying to guess passwords. It's somebody coming to a site that has a pretty good idea of what their email login and what their password is already, and they're getting in with just one login, really not going through any security checks because they have the login information as if you were to just share it with like a Netflix or Hulu or something like that. I feel like that it's the new kind of fraud front that people are going to have to combat. Other businesses might think differently, but at least from my experience so far, it's really been like the bigger headache as opposed to traditional payment fraud.
Any other panels?
Yeah, I'll say, so for us it's a little bit different because we do sell like physical products, so we're gonna ship something to you, so we still see a lot of payment fraud. That being said, you kind of like always want to be ahead and proactive about fraud, and you don't want to know you have a problem until you have like a problem that's a fire that you need to put out. So I think across the industry it's something that everyone is looking into. I know Science has an ATO score now that you can use as well. It's just something that everyone's mindful of because it's just so easy to find compromised credentials.
Yeah, I'd say it's one of those things where I think people understand the general premise of payment fraud because it's like, I want something of value, but I don't want to pay for it, therefore I shall steal it. But as more companies, introduce loyalty programs, that experiential thing we talked about in the slides about, it's not just a vacation, it's a memory, et cetera, et cetera. Like ATO becomes more attractive there too, right? Because it's taking from that, those points or whatever you might have built up, and taking advantage of that. It's the unfortunate thing of being valuable is people inherently want to take that value, which is kind of a bummer. I saw a question in the front. Did you want to?
Yeah. With the merchant, how do you, or from either perspective, how do you find the location of the fraud? And particularly, I'll give you an example. A very long time ago, 18 months, I have 4 different cards. All 4 of them got compromised in the same 4 weeks. The one thing I had in common was ordering online, ordering out a takeout meal from a particular place. I only found out because the credit cards actually caught it and called. Debit cards did not. But it was all 4 in the same 4 weeks. How do you find the locus of where that's going to be? How do you protect the merchant from the customer loss, the customer from the card loss?
I remember a case at delivery actually where the merchant was taking the credit card, skimming it, placing orders with themselves through the website, then not making the orders, right? So we just like orders clearing through, and every order was charged back. I think so that does happen.
Just take another layer. This was like through a Grubhub or a...
Yes.
So there was another layer in this whole thing.
Yes, so that's another thing where there are false front ends. And the false front end can transmit to a legitimate player and skim the credit card numbers that way. I think that is more a question for issuing banks than it is for... It's not the way a merchant is going to think about it typically. And it's also not the way I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's not the way that we, at least, think about fraud prevention, because we're looking at the actor behind the transaction. So we're much more likely to see other data points that are associated with your credit card that don't make sense with your credit card, rather than connecting the credit card to all the different places that could have been compromised. We're on the prevention of the monetization of it, not trying to find where it was stolen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm liking the hands. I'll answer this quickly and then I'll pass the mic. Another way you can think about it, to piggyback off of the last question, which I really liked, is if you believe the premise that most of our information is available online anyways, it's relatively simple to, purport to be from this location, or just, suggest that you are, unfortunately. So to your point, Colin, you really require depth of signals to get you going. Thanks.
That particular fraud is called compromised points of purchase. So the fraud chargeback never shows up at the point where it's compromised. So let's say I'm a fraudster, I'm a bad waiter, let's say, at a restaurant, and I then compromise all the cards, and then I take the list of cards and I sell it or I use it elsewhere. So nobody in the payment value chain will have visibility to what's happening at that particular location except the network, because the issuers won't have that information, or the processor, or the processor, right. So the networks actually have models to locate common points of purchase, whether it's a credit card transaction or an ATM compromise that's happening as well. So the networks do have models that locate this.
Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I think if anyone's a Sopranos fan, I think there was an episode around this and Amex cards. Apologies for not remembering the episode, but yeah, it's a thing. Okay, thanks all for answers. We're kind of coming into the home stretch, at least from the merchant panel side. So last question. Is anyone using layered risk scoring, biometrics, or multi-layered identity verification as a merchant?
No.
Okay. Is that, if you can't answer, is that more a resources issue or just like, it's in the pipe kind of a thing?
I think we're just not there yet. So, yeah, just don't need it yet. We'll probably need it soon, or eventually. I think everyone needs everything eventually, but for right now, what we have is working fine.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, thanks.
In point of fact, delivery is, because they're using it for it. But I don't know hardly any merchants that do it themselves, for what it's worth.
Yeah, and I think it also goes to, I think, Megan, you were talking about merchant education, or just like an education piece on buyers is such a big thing, where even if you were to use one of these solutions, that might introduce something where it's like, I don't know, I think this is in Demolition Man. I'm going weird with the references tonight. There's like an eye scan or something, right? You have to get to a point where people find that commonplace, or they would think to do that in order to use a purchase. Like maybe Touch IDs there, because people have that familiarity with, sorry, not to besmirch Android folks, for unlocking your phone or your device, and you might use that to also pay. Maybe that's the closest thing there, but yeah. Go ahead.
Well, so there's I guess there's biometrics, which is the eye scan, and then there's behavioral biometrics, which I think means something else, right? Those behavioral biometrics can be really frictionless, right? Looking at how people tilt the phone and how they type and things like that. I think that is embedded in a lot of the recent technologies in fraud detection solutions, but not our scale.
Yeah, no, yeah, like pressure on the phone, yeah, de-swiper type,
Right.
things like that. Yeah, exactly.
I think it also depends on like the merchant site as well. Like our company is very desktop based. You download images. They want you to stay on the site. They want you to edit your images there or your footage. So we have way more sales coming through on our desktop site than we do on our mobile. If mobile grows stronger, I think that's when a merchant can start to explore like kind of like using these other kind of biometric kind of device fingerprinting as well. So our company's not there today. I think it could have value, but it's hard to like kind of gauge that until you really get there though.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think part of it's customer adoption as well. So like my bank does allow me to do like a voice unlocking of my account, and I just think it's weird. So I think also it depends on your customer base and if they would find it, valuable and be willing to go the extra mile for that as well.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I think there was an article recently in like Payment Source where they were talking about like how many people are actually paying by voice anyways. Like if you're asking Alexa to get your groceries or things like that, it's still pretty small.
Almost zero.
Yeah, but I think we're all anticipating that it could grow, but TBD. Cool. All right.
Could I just throw out one for,
Yeah,
this is
sure.
for the next panel as well. When does the consumer get tired of the continual probes? When does that outweigh the convenience of ordering online? Because the probes are picking up, the multiple phone calls you get every day with nobody there or pretending to be something else, the emails, the phishing. And I don't know that there's an answer, but it's something worth thinking about.
Any thoughts on friction?
We're already tired. It is exhausting. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that the customer can't do as well to protect themselves, and it just kind of comes with the ease of convenience with ordering. And I think maybe a couple of years from now, I think there's still a lot of online consumers that are out there that don't really understand fraud. So when it happens to them, they think like, oh, why didn't you protect me? Why didn't this happen? I think maybe some years from now, people will kind of accept that level of risk that it comes with using as e-commerce.
Well, we built a whole industry around zero liability to the consumer, so, I mean, why would I care?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the difficult challenge is, I think a lot of people here know, as fraud analysts know, is when you think about like account takeover, like, well, did you use this password on any other sites that were recently compromised? And chances are yes, but the consumers, they say, well, maybe you should have changed my password ahead of time if you knew of that. So it is tiring from both sides, but it's something I think both sides can get a little better on, from a consumer and a merchant side as well, in fraud prevention.
Yeah, I think a lot of that sometimes can be like, though I don't have a numerical answer for you. Context can be really helpful, right? Where it's just, we are introducing this, like, let's say 3D Secure 2.0. Like, we're just going to have you do this extra level of verification for your protection, something like that. I find that tends to help a lot of those conversations where even if it's not welcomed by the customer, hopefully you would appeal to the rational person that understands it's with their best interest in mind. I can appreciate maybe there's a limit to how many times you can extend that courtesy, but hopefully initially you can kind of build that trust over time. Question?
Yeah, just a quick question. Do you see dynamic data on the consumer side? Because so far you're talking about a lot of static data that the consumer gives you. If the consumer now has dynamic data like they have in the chip, will that help with online fraud?
Dynamic data like behavioral biometrics?
No, some sort of dynamic data that the consumer has and changes so the consumer, when they make the order, are giving you something that in the next order they place will be different.
So like a
Why would a consumer want
sophisticated,
to do that?
like a sophisticated two-factor authentication.
Mm-hmm.
Like a virtual card.
Yeah, I would say the consumer is never going to do that. Frankly, because I wouldn't. If the website imposed it, unless it was across the industry, and I couldn't order on Amazon without doing that, right? then I'm just going to go to the person that doesn't make me do that, right? Because again, I don't have liability, and there are two, separate issues here. One is the harassment that consumers feel because of compromised information and the phishing attacks, and then the other is friction. I don't think consumers are ever going to tolerate friction in the industry, and payments and retailers will evolve around that. As for the phishing, I think it's uncorrelated. That's going on anyway, right? And that does have a lot more to do with how easily accessible information is right now. Hopefully that does get better. I don't see it getting better anytime soon.
I think about where things are going with one click, with Lyfts and Ubers, where payment disappears. So that's the direction, in my opinion, that payments are going. They disappear in the transaction. No one goes in and says, I want to pay today. They want to do something in which payment is a part. So to introduce another layer on it, to say you can do it, to your point, don't go someplace else.
They are doing that in Europe with two-factor authentication, and I think it's going to be awful. People are going to hate it.
I agree.
Just a comment on that.
Yeah.
So
Hold on. So virtual cards, we tried virtual cards when I was at MasterCard. It did have friction issues and it didn't go to take off. OTPs, one-time password, do help in account takeover. However, if you send the OTP via SMS text, they're intercepted, and obviously it's become a problem because what you're doing is you're simply entering it onto the website. So if it's a keylogger that picks it up as well, they actually change the web page, they delay the transaction, they're able to even wire money even despite OTPs. What we're seeing is the trend is more towards dynamic transactions. If you look at cryptos, if you follow cryptos at all, they're entirely playing a different game. We play with static credentials. The merchant's sitting in the payment value chain. Cryptos, the merchant's not even in the payment value chain. So that's the model that we are getting towards, where everything is dynamic. And if we see that trend going, sooner or later, payments will shift to the way cryptos operate.
Thank you.
Cool. All right.
Don't say the B word.
Sort of piggyback on this idea. Do you think that there's anything else that's not really being addressed today that, as far as obviously like customer friction, but anything else maybe having to do, you mentioned with SIPs, their account takeover score, or anything else in general that you would like addressed from the merchant point of view?
Merchants, anything?
Kind of a big question. Just throwing that out there.
I mean, I think the thing I find most annoying is friendly fraud, which is not very friendly. But it's just, you can't find it, right? Because it has all the signs of being a valid transaction. It's just, somebody else in your family who has access to your credit card has decided to buy something without your permission, right? And I think that's kind of like the most annoying thing right now for me that's not easily addressed. I don't think there's anything to do about it because it's not authorized by the original cardholder, so it's kind of the end of the story.
Yeah, there's a lot to that question, you don't know. I guess like off the top of my head, I could even start thinking about like some way of kind of like scraping. You think about like those forums. At one point you thought about like compromised credentials as something just living on the dark web, and you set up your Tor and you go to .onion domains to like find that stuff. But it's really kind of just bleed into the public domain where you can just Google these. You can say, if I need an email and a password, you can just kind of Google a paste bin, go onto it and take it and go sign up to another merchant. So, I mean, maybe doing like another check of, I mean, it might be everybody's email at this point, but yeah, it is. It's mine's out there, everybody's out there, but if there's other sites you find at more risk or anything like that, like if someone comes to sign up with you and they have a compromised email, maybe it raises a red flag that like, hey, let's check this person before they sign up because they're compromised somewhere. Let's make sure that we think this is the actual person. But I feel like that's like one of 100 other things we could be checking as well. So.
Yeah, and then I'd say, and I'll wrap on this, it's tough to think like we all exist in a world where your personal information is essentially available for sale. or like if not once, many times over. And a lot of legacy infrastructure is built on the premise that that is not the case. You know, where it's you verify your mother's maiden name, you know, your first dog's name. I don't know, getting weird. But it's one of those things where customers think to answer truthfully to those questions. There's a whole school of thought now where maybe you shouldn't, because your truthful answers are already out there. So I think that's kind of another big thought process is if you inherently distrust the legitimate data, how do you make sense of it otherwise? So I think that's kind of a big overarching question, and I think it's a lot of, well, hopefully we can get into the expert panel and, you know, just big problems to solve for sure for all of us.
And you
Cool.
keep your lies straight.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank
thank
you.
you, Megan, Rachel, and
Mitch.
really appreciate it. You can continue.
So if Rakesh and Stefan would like to join us?
Wherever you want. Up to your life.
So,
This thing on? Yep, it's on.
So Colin, I'd like to start with you because Forder published a fraud attack index for 2017. Can you summarize for us what that study showed as far as the trends?
I can. I was actually resisting answering this question earlier about ATOs, because that certainly is the flavor of the month. The two biggest trends I think that we saw was account takeover abuse, and that does affect payment, but it's across the funnel, loyalty point monetization, coupon abuse, and things like that. But it's it's completely. I'm sure I'm saying things that are of no surprise to anybody on the panel. It's a particularly nefarious kind of fraud because you are using aged accounts that by definition have good credentials, and you need to pierce, the actor behind it in order to detect it. And to do that, you need fairly sophisticated tools and analysis going on, right? And I think this is also leads into one of the things I was saying earlier, which is most merchants aren't equipped to do that, frankly. And the second big trend, and the Pac-Man analogy is right. There is a very clear inverse correlation between account takeovers and identity manipulation. That type of fraud, where you're just hiding, behind different credentials and not actually exploiting the account. That type of fraud has gone down almost in perfect inverse correlation to account takeovers going up.
Skimmed credentials.
Skimmed credentials, yes. Which you have to use under a manipulated identity. And I think the other major trend we saw was in digital goods, which is also, I think, unsurprising. That was up something like 167% year over year. And again, that I think goes to the nature of the canary in the coal mine analogy, which is a lot of the digital goods are typically cleared immediately monetizable, and so they're particular targets of attack. That doesn't mean the attacks aren't going to come in the other verticals. They're just going towards easy first.
Like pictures, maybe.
Pictures, tickets, even digital games that you can download, things like that. Gift cards.
Yeah, gift cards are a good one.
Gift cards, good way to launder money.
Yeah. So Prakash, you used to lead fraud at MasterCard. That was a while ago. How have things changed since that time?
Well, not much has changed. The vectors are pretty much the same, meaning phishing and spear phishing is standard attack forms. If you during holiday seasons, you get mass phishing emails that look like emails from FedEx, Amazon, They're targeting people, primarily the elderly. And then spear phishing campaigns are rampant. If you look at every single compromise out there in the market today, any type of compromise, whether it's the Bangladesh bank or what the FBI just announced today, that the cyber criminals are planning a big ATM heist. They're all spear phishing attacks. They target one individual in an organization and they send some file. If they accidentally open it, that's it. They now have access to the kingdom. And they start to move around, compromise the data. So the vectors haven't changed. The targets have changed. So we're no longer talking about magstripe compromises. Why? Because we put in controls. We changed the way we operate. We have magstripes, but we depend entirely on the chip. But it's now all online. Online merchants are at risk, huge risk. Suppliers to various entities, they're at risk because they're being compromised. It's all cyber initiated. The attacks are primarily account takeover via spear phishing. So that's where you see all the compromises at.
It just makes me wonder, who are these people and do they ever get arrested? They
No.
always get away with it.
They're all over the place. There are two types of attackers, if you will, cyber attackers. The one is for profit, and their goal, that's a franchised operation. There are a lot of people that are willing to identify vulnerabilities. Then there are freelancers called zero-day vulnerability identifiers. So they look for vulnerability in particular software. For example, the guy who spotted Equifax not updating their Apache software was a zero-day identifier. If he's a freelancer. But what did he do? He turned around and sold it to the state. So the Chinese government has a state-operated entity that looks for things like that. And not just the Chinese government, even Microsoft and Apple and even the US government pays a lot of money for the zero-day vulnerability identifiers. So it's big business. If you want to get rich fast, this is years away.
So it's like being a consultant.
Right,
only on the
exactly. But they're not necessarily bad. They're willing to operate with people who are legitimate as well. And these people never get caught. I mean, the cyber hackers never get caught because they are sitting in countries with no extradition treaties. So they're never going to catch them. In fact, when we were at MasterCard, we used to work with the Interpol on a particular heist, and we couldn't catch those guys because they were sitting in Ukraine. But apparently one day they decided to take a vacation in Cyprus and showed up with their laptops, and sure enough, the Interpol was waiting for them there. So that's the only way you can catch them.
So maybe another thought on like the fraudster persona there is really they are entrepreneurs to make the problem a little bit simpler. Is it dead? Oh. So
I
to make
hacked
it, so to make it a little simpler and lighter for the e-commerce space, like in e-commerce, you typically do not need to find and actually like find the criminal and lock them in, like lock them up. All you need to really do is make it harder on your side to steal from you than from your neighbor. And so what will happen, since they're entrepreneurs, they will actually move on and go to someone else and steal from there. Which is why in retail, like they actually, like pretty much the atmosphere right now is there is a chance to win this. Because it's again not winning to actually find all these people, kind of lock them in and do all of that, but rather make it just tougher than anybody else's door to knock down.
It's like avoiding a bear attack, right? You run faster than your friend.
But there's just not much satisfaction in the fact that they never face justice, I guess. But I had a question for you, which is, I think your company wrote a blog or an article about mining the value of false positives, which is really interesting. So if you never get any fraud, you don't learn anything, and kind of the opposite. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. So I mean, we started mainly with the loss prevention kind of focus as a company, and we really like learned more and more that it's about enabling the business side of the e-commerce space. So one of the things that always kind of like struck us, we heard a lot about false positive already, so I don't think we need to go into detail what that is. But mainly what we believed was if you have any sort of like learning feedback, whether it's rule engines with appropriate like analysts behind it, it's a machine learning or any other kind of cycle, if you only feed it the bad data of like there's still chargebacks, so avoid orders that look like that, it will just spiral down to be very defensive over time. So what we figured is you need to have a counterpoint feedback loop that actually feeds in like all the good data points the false positives of this is actually something we have declined so far, but should not have. And really the only way that we figured that you can do this is by control group, which is typically how you do this in statistical analysis. And what it takes is to take a sample that you believe is fraudulent, still ship it out, and confirm that it really becomes a chargeback. Because if it doesn't, it was a false positive. Feeding that data back into your cycle actually now does a counterbalance to your pretty much like the negative data point of chargebacks. And all of a sudden, like the system is self-balancing, particularly if you have enough data streams on both. It's costly, but we believe this is R&D invested in data, like any other data source, be it device fingerprinting, biometrical. I mean, that's just a data source you need.
Okay, any other comments on that topic? You know, one thing, you mentioned the Chinese government and probably North Korea. If we have criminal rings that are funded by state actors, how is the industry ever going to keep up with this? We're just smarter than them, I hope, right? Does anyone have any perspective?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I'll tell you, this is exactly, I think, why it's a great case for why I don't think long-term merchants should be in the business of fraud detection. They are operating from a constrained data network, and they are, they have a lot to worry about by themselves. And it would be one thing if fraud was something that you could solve definitively by investment and have it go away. But that's not the nature of the threat. The threat is dynamic, and so you have to solve for it every single day. Should that be part of a merchant's life? I would argue no, because the problem is going to get worse and more sophisticated. And it's one of the few areas where it actually makes sense to outsource. Frankly, just, the analogy I draw all the time is cloud architecture, right? And I did live through this on the merchant side, where, in the beginning, when it was early, when cloud hosting was in its infancy, it was considered sort of an SMB type solution. And, a few large merchants kind of shifted their architecture to the cloud, and all of a sudden it became okay. And you look back on it and you say, I can't believe I built tech stacks, and swapped out disks and planned for peak load, 12 months out. It's crazy talk. And that's essentially what merchants are doing with fraud, because they're at a fundamental disadvantage, and versus the people that are attacking them, and they need a way to combine effectively their resources, and their resources are their data, and that's a big advantage if you can use a combined data network against this type of threat. It gives you some hope.
Yeah, I believe long term the merchant's not even going to be the payment value chain, like the way the cryptos are moving. So, but that's going to be a while. So today, there are two parts to the fraud story. If you're a merchant, one is the external fraud that's at the transaction level, where you're getting the stolen data coming in. To prevent that, you've got to have a layered strategy. I mean, that's the problem, and the layered strategy involves starting with the device, with the IP. You talked about behavioral biometrics. Remember, who's visiting your site more often than your customer? It's the fraudster. Because if they've been able to come to the site and profit out of it and exploit it, they're going to come back. So if you put in behavioral biometrics, we've seen that if you put in not only typing speed, but actually click move, if you have an agreement, let's say you have to establish an account, you have an agreement, guess what? 99% of the time, fraudsters don't just click the agreement. They don't even read it. So the speed with which they move through the site is a very good indicator that this person's not reading all the documents. And given that, and the fact that they've seen some device anomalies, it's a very good red flag. So behavioral biometrics to focus on known fraud is a very good way, because normally these solutions generate a lot of alerts. And you need a lot of people to sift through the alerts. But if you fine-tune it to known fraud, you'd be able to cull out all the known fraud pretty quickly. So behavioral biometrics and then behavioral analytics, machine learning analytics in the back end. It's a layered strategy that you need to have. And then for the merchant, as it is for any financial institution or any entity, it's the second part of the fraud is internal fraud via hacking and malware. Cyber attackers coming in the other way, which is, let's say, through your email channel, and then doing a spear phishing attack, getting into your corporate network, and then starting to compromise data. There you need to have a robust solution, and you need to constantly monitor vulnerabilities, updates, etc. So that's a very important, those two are two important things that they have to monitor. And that's the only way you can beat them, at least mitigate the fraud. You can't beat them.
The scenario you're describing sounds exactly like what the Russians were doing with the DNC and
yeah, I mean, the
social engineering of security.
Yeah, so if you know that particular issue, the Clinton emails, John Podesta got an email and it said your Google account has a security issue. And he sent it to his IT guy and said, can you check this? And the IT guy responded saying it's fine. Sure enough, it was a phishing email, a spear phishing email.
I hope the IT guy is doing something else.
Yeah, something about it, but
yeah. Wait a second. So you're saying if I don't read over the terms and conditions, like for let's say iTunes update, I might be a hacker? That's like a good data point. If I don't read over the,
I haven't checked you. I haven't done a background check on you.
No, trust me, I'm good.
But I'm saying, in general, when you have an account, an online account setup process, usually there are a lot of factors. Yep. This is one of the factors, one of the ingredients that the behavioral biometrics uses to see if, with the speed with which you're moving through. So, for example, if I'm creating a lot of new accounts at a bank, and that means I've got a stack of identity information from stolen identities, right? I don't know anything about them. What do? I have it in an Excel spreadsheet. And I come in and do it manually, I cut and paste, right? So the cut and paste speed is consistent across applications. You can check that. If I use the bot flies through in a few seconds. So again, speed becomes an important issue. So these are the factors you should be looking for.
Yeah, I was going to ask about bots, but your comment before about merchants shouldn't try and attack this on their own kind of begs the question, should the industry as a whole be sharing data more, and are there any initiatives in that direction?
So, I mean, I kind of go back to the retail idea of like, I don't think retail should try to fix this themselves. I mean, that's why we have like crime fighting, like government entities out there. And I mean, there's a whole other crowd of people who tries to really beat cybercrime, find these gangsters, find these and kind of like put them behind bars. I don't think retail should burden themselves trying to do this, because to the point that Collins made earlier, like they're not equipped to that, they don't have the time, and technically they don't have a mandate. I mean, all that a fraud team and a retail organization should do is protect that particular organization from the impact of fraud. That you shouldn't necessarily go out there and find all these gangsters and kind of like take them on, which is why sometimes I don't like the language that this industry very often uses, where it's about fighting fraud or actually like really taking on like this enemy approach. It's like you're almost taking this a little bit too far as a fraud team for an e-commerce
That's what we
retailer.
called this NIPE event, is fighting fraud. We made a big mistake.
So that's a very interesting point then. Where should the responsibility and thus who should bear the cost of fighting? It's a very valid point.
MasterCard, obviously. so we need a paradigm shift for that, right? The current paradigm is the merchant is the one who owns most of their liability. Then they try to pass it on to the issuer pushes it back with chargebacks, etc. The paradigm shift has to be what we've seen in the crypto world, where the consumer is responsible. If I somebody steals my wallet, I'm foolish enough to leave it.
So in other words, moving away from zero liability paradigm that we've had that got everyone to accept plastic.
So if something happens to your card, what's your liability as a card owner?
Nothing.
Nothing.
I just call up as long as I do it with it.
It's exact. Let's start there. We don't own any responsibility for our lack of for safeguarding our credentials. I mean, we provide social security numbers to our doctor's office. Doctors ask for social security numbers. Why do they need social security numbers? That's a target. We've seen cyber attacks at doctors' offices because They don't have the best IT systems in the world.
Intellectually, that makes perfect sense, but practically, I mean, you'd shift us more back to cash than we are now.
Yeah. It's the crypto world that's going to shift the paradigm, but it's going a long ways away.
A long time.
But until then, you're going to have this struggle.
I would make the case here, since I have the opportunity, that
and the microphone.
And the microphone. And the hostile captive audience. This is one of the reasons why the liability shift model exists in the fraud detection space. The consumers aren't going to. The consumers have the bank accounts. Nobody's going to make them wear the risk, right? It's unfortunate that it has been pushed down the chain to the merchant. It's not fair. There's a lot of people in the payments chain, and it's the merchant who's bringing them the consumer that is pegged with the risk. I don't know if that's so great. So people that are doing the fraud detection, yeah, it actually does kind of make sense that they take the liability. And so it's not for everyone, but I think that's a good thing to exist, because then, the people that are preventing it are, sort of putting the money where their mouth is.
Just as a sort of an aside, it's an edge case, but in Canada, there is a group called the Ombudsman, which it has in certain cases reversed friendly fraud back to the card holder. So that was what they were really careless with their card, and they wrote their PIN number on the back of it or something like that. I'm sure it doesn't happen too often, but it's not going to solve our problems here. But
Fighting fraud is tough in the U.S. I mean, if you look across the UK, Australia, Canada, they're all consortiums because there are only a few banks, right? So they're going to get together and figure out how to create a shared fraud database, fraud solution, and so on. In the U.S., it's impossible because there's so many financial institutions, thousands of retailers. It's very hard to bring everybody together because there's so many invested. I mean, look at the task force that the Federal Reserve has in terms of faster payments and secure payments and all that. I mean, they're still struggling to figure out what the right solution is.
Are there any attempts to share fraud data across the industry? I'm sure maybe by the networks, but are there any other?
The networks, they each have their shared fraud data, but I haven't seen one outside the networks.
There's Porter.
Yeah, I'd say people. I think we all kind of create our own fiefdoms, right? Okay. But there may be some this is prepared for the most boring answer. Like you might have some contractual arrangement where you just cannot share. I think what I found positively, people generally come to events like this and you can talk best practices or something like that. But I'm unaware of something where there's like a truth. Everyone signs a thing.
I also do think we've seen the flip side of that, really scratching the surface of the media, of the consumer now being seen as somebody whose data is being shared, even though it's in the context of fraud or risk. It's still seen as sharing that necessarily this consumer hasn't really opted into. If you go back to countries like Europe, you now have data privacy that really doesn't allow that unless you find really good exceptions, and all of them are somewhat in question. So I think there's also the public opinion of is sharing the data really the right thing for people to do, and if so, how is it governed? So maybe again, sharing the data to fight the gangsters should be maybe something that is not done within retail or within let's say full business entities that we all are.
Yeah, European citizens have a concept of a right to privacy, heaven forbid, with their information, which I think makes operating in the U.S. difficult because that isn't an inherent right.
By the way, I know it doesn't apply in this case directly, but there's Secure Payments Task Force recommended a data sharing task force for faster payments, which is the new kind of payments like Zelle. And because that's even worse, you can detect the fraud, the money's already gone. You can't get it back.
Yeah. And sharing data sounds good, but actually it's the timeliness and the accuracy of the data that's reported. Usually that's where it falls apart. Because nobody's going to put resources in sending all the events. First they start out great, but slowly you'll see bad data get into a shared database. We've seen that when I was at MasterCard.
Questions from the audience? I'll circle around with the microphone.
I was just going to ask, I'd reach out to the FBI to see if there was some sort of government information that might be able to. Sure. I was curious, I reached out to see if there was a government organization that would be doing this within the U.S.
Secret Service.
Yeah. Is that what it is? Yeah, I was just going to say, FBI told me that there wasn't, and I was curious. It was an interesting conversation. So, if there is anything, I would love to know what that is.
Not at the transaction level. They can tell you schemes, but not at the transaction.
And the FS ISAC is more between banks, looking at attacks of the banks.
Potential schemes that are there.
Yeah,
Which again,
cybersecurity and less fraud.
Yeah.
which is also another point, like why really like doing this kind of low level, like low volume kind of fraud scheme really is very lucrative, because there's again nobody really battling you other than the retail, and if the retail sticks to more protecting themselves, I mean, you're somewhat safe doing that. And that obviously entrepreneurial spirit, I mean, a lot of people get that. There is an opportunity. The system allows it to be done. And so people seize that opportunity, which is why I think we see a lot of like ATO and all of this good stuff, because it's just being proven to work. So there's people who do it.
Yeah, they're not doing it because it doesn't work.
Yeah, and it's actually become so easy to perpetrate fraud that I think people are now looking at it as not illegal. Honestly.
There's no prosecution. There's no consequence.
That's right.
And actually, I don't know if you saw that, but there was an 11-year-old girl at DEFCON in Vegas this week that managed to hack the election system. Right? So, you know what? What's going to happen to that kid?
Yeah.
And yet we're teaching our children to do this. Because that's their future.
Yeah, to like a bug bounty, right? Yeah. Yeah,
So
there's...
what was the case again? I didn't know.
There was a kid at DEFCON in Vegas this week, an 11-year-old managed to change the votes for the Floridas, and they had like a mock how to hack
Something like
the
30 minutes.
Yeah, like it took her no time to, she found it too easy. This 11-year-old said it was obvious how to do it.
Okay.
Right? So yeah, change the votes. No, actually.
With so-called friendly fraud, is there a database of where things are shipped to, you know, who it's shipped to? Because that seems like an obvious repeat.
Yeah, that has a lot to do with merchant policies. We see a high correlation with friendly fraud to merchants that have very restrictive return policies, for example, right? Where it's really a service chargeback being filed as fraud. That's a common scenario. But it can be, you know, there's a lot of different scenarios, like a kid using the parent's credit card, or divorced couples, you know, that still share credit cards. It's by definition the appropriate account holder filing a chargeback under fraud that wasn't fraud, right? Which makes it, again, very hard to detect because it's a legitimate actor, right?
I was thinking more with the reshippers, you know, people that are shipping things on behalf of someone else then to another country.
Yeah, that's there's legitimate purposes for that.
Yeah, there can be known addresses for
for
businesses that actually provide that. It seems far afield, but some people, you know, there's the sign on a lamppost that says, "Hey, are you looking for work from home?" Or people will unknowingly reship. So the number of addresses and people that can participate in it can accelerate quickly, even outside of like known addresses that might, no offense to the great state of New York, exist in New York or Florida or something like that.
Was your question, is there a database of reshippers? Or
Well, people that commit friendly fraud and trying to identify where the main areas where those reshippers are. I think a lot are in Delaware, places like obviously Florida as well, places that are near a coast that are easy to ship from, but it seems like a very common problem.
That's not friendly fraud.
That's where you're buying 100 wedding dresses and shipping them to Ukraine.
Well, they've been shipped somewhere in the U.S. to be reshipped somewhere else.
But that's actual fraud, not friendly fraud.
Well, yeah.
it's either actual fraud or it's something that the merchant would prevent by policy that's not fraud, right? And that's not uncommon because especially international or global retailers
want to prevent currency arbitrage in the inventory, right? So if they sell in Europe and they also sell in the U.S., they're very careful about how they set prices, and they don't want, you know, someone to capitalize on and arbitrage the prices. Or they've got, you know, mandates from their suppliers if they are, you know, a retailer and not a brand themselves on where they can ship to. So there's two separate issues. I wouldn't necessarily classify either of them as friendly fraud.
Yeah, that's not really fraud either. I mean, if you're just buying
The latter is not fraud.
Yeah, you're shipping a bunch of stuff that you bought cheaper here, somebody else will be selling.
There's also the whole country of Russia that can't order anything off Amazon using a Visa or MasterCard, and they have to get their stuff somehow, right?
Yep.
They're another country.
Next question, I think the question is more, why don't we share that data? Why,
whether it's friendly or other, sorry. I think the question was more to do with the fact that, is there a way of, so what's friendly in some cases probably still fraud, actually, to be fair. It's just convenient to be considered friendly fraud, right? My child ordered it, I didn't mean to, type thing. So if sharing that kind of information actually helps detect some of the patterns in that way.
Yeah, I think what's difficult with that, I'd love to hear everyone's opinion, where it's what isn't necessarily a data point there, or what that cardholder might share with the merchant is intent. So you could have two of the exact same situation, two parents, and both of their children use their card erroneously, but one is purporting to do that and the other isn't. But it may be categorized identically. I think that's getting to the root cause is difficult, if not, like, I think it's tough to expect people to
We could
categorize
have a
that.
database of dishonest people.
What's your definition of dishonest, though?
Someone who would do that, like I ordered something off Amazon and I had the wrong amount,
But are you the
and they
arbiter?
wouldn't let me return it without paying shipping, so I just kept it, but I could have said, I didn't order this.
Are you the arbiter of dishonesty? No, it's tough.
When they classify it as fraud, typically the card does need to be reissued, and so immediately there's a turnover of credentials.
There's one case of friendly fraud, which is not shared amongst everybody, but shared amongst financial institutions. It's called bust out, card bust out, where there are a bunch of people who get card accounts and they act okay for a long time. So I could get a card account, someone else could get an account on my account, a sub card or whatever, and they'll be fine for a while, and then all of a sudden the purchases ramp up and they disappear. So that particular information was previously classified as fraud. Now it's called bust out because it's premeditated. It's an application problem because that's when the fraud comes in. So they're now sharing that amongst financial institutions through the networks.
So one thing we noticed is like particular friendly fraud, the term being sometimes like used really broadly. I mean, originally I think it was the accidental fraud that was meant by that. So what we just talked about is more abusive behavior on the customer side. So customer abuse actually becomes an adjacent problem to fraud. It's technically not entirely like the same thing. And there are even like more edge cases when, let's say, somebody ordering a nice cocktail dress for like an event they want to go to, and the next day they return it because they really just needed it for that evening. But within the return policy of this merchant, so technically there was nothing criminal going on here.
That merchant would call that abuse. That would be like how a merchant might.
I mean, the merchant would probably see it that way, but then if it's within the policy of what was actually granted to the consumer, technically there was nothing.
Yeah, but it's still had that for a long time.
Now we have read the wrong way. We're going to take like maybe two more questions so we have time to network.
I have a quick question about how AI, particularly machine learning, is going to impact e-commerce on the negative side. Because you can use, AI is helping detect fraud, but how is there a potential for AI to actually cause threats and encourage more fraud?
Actually, yes. So we've seen some new trends. So guess what? So let's say you're a financial institution or a retailer. You've put in the most sophisticated machine learning analytics, and then it's able to detect fraud. What they're doing is something very analogous to denial of service attacks. So normally in banks, when they see a significant denial of service, meaning your whole website goes down, that's when they see a lot of fraudulent wires go through. So Here they've identified a way to generate legitimate false positives that look like fraud transactions. So over a short period of time, you'll see a burst of legitimate transactions come through, but they all look like fraud transaction to the machine learning algorithm. Meanwhile, the call center has investigated, and then of course they're all legitimate transactions. So what's the next thing that happens? They call the fraud manager and they say, your models are not working, let's recalibrate them. So they pull down the model for a short period of time. And that's when the attack happens.
To really kind of double down on that one, it is the fact that it's known to the fraudsters that we're using machine learning on our end.
Yeah.
So this is actually an exploitable fact itself. A machine learning, by definition, learns automatically. So without, I think we had it earlier on the panel when somebody said the intuition of like an analyst that really knows what they're doing to anticipate moves. Like without that security or that safety net, like, I mean, this machine learning, like the Microsoft bot that was this chatbot that all of a sudden went completely rogue, it wasn't hacked, it wasn't really like anything, it was just retrained.
That was the racist bot.
Right. And the same practice kind of happened in fraud prevention as well. Like if you seed the data the right way, which is probably also a downside of sharing the data, like if a seeder would actually seed that into a consortium network, all of that is exploitable by the fraud side because they now understand really well how these decisions are made and like how you could actually nudge the machine to think differently about it.
Yeah, or take the machine offline.
Yeah, I was gonna say
so that's what they're focusing on.
Yeah, the truth. I'll go quickly on the truth answer.
No, go.
I was gonna say the
We're on the same team.
Yeah, the truth sets there are really important, right? With even if you think something is truly bad or truly good, that can change over time. So retraining is really critically important there. And then I think the other pitfall could be is even if there's an unintentional bias, where even if you create the best model and it's the best at fighting fraud, but it unintentionally affects certain populations or locations disproportionately to what your business is. That can be another pitfall where, again, like someone sitting who's actually designing it is like, I'm going to prevent fraud in Canada, and that's your aim, but maybe it's quite terrible for someone in Puerto Rico, again, unintentionally. Colin, sorry, go ahead.
I agree with all that. I was gonna take issue with the fact that it was more exploitable than, say, a rules-based system or a human analyst is. I think those are very equally exploitable.
I didn't say more.
So,
just
yes, in that sense, certainly anything is exploitable by someone that is sophisticated enough. But are we taking measured risks? Just like I wouldn't say any system is completely secure, right? By extension, I wouldn't say any site could ever be perfectly secure against fraud. I think friendly fraud is a perfect example, right? There's a certain amount of actual fraud chargebacks that you will experience, even if your detection is perfect, because things are just misclassified, right? Are you going to optimize to take that to zero? No. But what are the best tools that you can use? I do think in this case, AI is the best tool in the chest right now.
So with that, we're going
I just one challenge, and I would say that we talked about a lot of different components, rules, talked about machine learning, AI, we've also talked about the case management, which sort of fills in that gray area. I would argue that it is those things working in concert together, and with any one, you're going to have massive blind spots and vulnerabilities. So when we talk about things like, are we retraining models wrong? When we were talking very early on about the idea of rule sets and going in and making changes, that's dangerous in and of itself, because if you look at things through a straw, you could be inadvertently retraining your models the wrong way through velocity checks or what have you. So I would be an advocate for saying, just like as we talk about the value chain and who's responsible for liability, I think it's not on any one person, it is everything working in concert. Same thing when it comes to rules, plus AI models, and whatever other arsenal that you've got.
I would agree with a lot of that. The one caution I would have is when you and I've seen this, and I've actually experienced it on the merchant side. It is tempting to layer things over and over and have them
ostensibly work together, the downside to that very often is the decline rate, right? You can get very good at detecting fraud and picking it up, but you can really and lull yourself into the feeling that you really have a good handle on it, but you're really giving up a lot of revenue. That's the difference.
Yeah. With that, I'm going to close the panel. We were welcome to stay around here for about another half an hour. I just am in awe of all of these outstanding panelists. Really, thank you. And I didn't mention before, but Sip Science and Signify both traveled all the way here from California to be here, so thank you for that. And let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Once a month, it's a volunteer organization other than Bill and his colleagues who we hired to make it happen. So if you've got ideas and join in, just send an email to you go on the NIPE site.
Or join the events committee.
We've got time for we've got time for a couple more drinks. I think we have to be out of here by 5:30. I hope you've enjoyed it. Tell your friends and have a very, very pleasant rest of your evening.
I wanted to say hi. Amy Weinberg.